Well, everyone, it's time for us to go and take a look at the Google Pixel 4 and see how this particular phone holds up in 2025. Now, the big thing I can definitely tell you is that, in my personal opinion, the Pixel 4 was an interesting phone when it first came out, but I probably will tell you there might be some better options to go and buy rather than this one. So I'll explain those better options throughout this whole entire video and the impact and what the Google Pixel 4 even brought in the first place. But if you do want to pick up some random phones that I would recommend buying this year, links will be down in the description below. You can get them from there and you can help support the channel at the exact same time. Now, starting off with the outside of the Google Pixel 4, this phone originally came out in 2019, and on the front side in the layout of this phone, it was interesting because it was a good looking phone for the most part. Even now for a 2019 phone, it still looks pretty good. There's not really that much to complain about here. This phone on the front side was giving you a 5.7 inch P OLED display. Now it was a 1080p panel, and for a 2019 phone, the bezel on the top and bottom was a little weird because we had already had phones like the OnePlus 7 Pro with virtually no bezel and the Galaxy S10 with that hole punch display that year. So this was kind of a weirder approach by Google, I think, from my particular viewpoint. But with that being said, I do think there were some things to keep in mind here too. This phone on the front side was giving you a 90Hz panel. That was a really big upgrade. This was the first time we got a 90Hz panel on any Google Pixel. In fact, I'm pretty sure this was before Samsung put any sort of high refresh rate panel inside of their phones. So if you take a look back at the Pixel 4, you're actually getting a phone on the Google Pixel 4 that was giving you a higher refresh rate. So that is kind of a legendary thing in and of itself. And once again, I do think if you were to go through and pick up a phone, that is a super important thing to keep in mind, that you're able to go through and pick up a phone like this and be able to get that type of capability. Because I do think, in my personal opinion, if you were to go through and pick up a device, that is a really nice thing to basically be able to have in my personal situation, my personal opinion. Now, on top of that, I think another very big thing to keep in mind here too, this phone was giving you a USB Type-C port on the bottom, which is always nice to have. You're also still going through and able to maintain a lot of other things going on with this type of phone too, such as the aluminum sides. This phone felt pretty premium for the most part too, which I really liked. You're also able to go through and still be able to go essentially buy a phone on the Galaxy, on the Google Pixel 4 with this kind of interesting back. The back of this phone was very interesting. It had this interesting texture. It was a glass back, I'm assuming. That's what a lot of people had told me. But it felt different. It didn't necessarily feel like a glass back. It felt like something a little bit different to me. But I did like this phone a lot because of that. It had a really unique feeling to it. Again, you had the aluminum sides. You had, standard wireless charging on this phone. But there really wasn't anything else super crazy going on within this particular device. But even back then, compared to other phones that came out back in 2019, this phone was missing out on a few things. Number one, it didn't have an ultra-wide camera on the backside, just a telephoto lens, which was a very weird approach from Google. I always never really understood why they did that. On top of that, a lot of the competition was giving you triple camera setups. This one was still at dual cameras, and this phone, for the most part, it still looked like a pretty good phone and a pretty good device. I still liked it, but this thing had more bezel on it than some of the competition as well. So those were kind of some minor things, but that wasn't really anything super crazy, and that wouldn't deter me away from using this phone by any means. But I think from that side, those were kind of the big things to keep in mind there. In terms of the price tag, you can probably find this phone on Amazon for less than $100, which I think is a really nice thing, right? That's a very cheap price to pay for a device like this. But with that being said, if you're going to go through and pick up a device like this, it might make more sense for you to go through and kind of look at some other devices to go and buy. I know this thing is a cheap price, and I know this thing can look like a really good device in and of itself. But like I said before, there might be some better options out there for some people, and it might make more sense for you to go and kind of look into those, in my personal opinion. When it comes down to the camera side of things, this phone on the front side, on the back side too, it's giving you a dual camera setup, a 12.2 megapixel wide angle lens, 16 megapixel telephoto lens, then an 8 megapixel wide angle camera on the front side. Now, this type of camera, as you could probably imagine, it is a little bit outdated. It's not giving you an ultra wide camera. But the thing here, and the biggest problem I always had with the Google Pixels of this time, was that their resolutions, for a long period of time, I think for 2 generations, the Google Pixels were known to have the best Android cameras, or one of the best cameras on a phone. But then they really dropped off. The Pixel 3 XL, they really dropped off. And still with the Pixel 4, they were still behind. This phone is giving you 4K at 30 on the back and 1080p at 30 on the front. To give you some perspective, The Galaxy S10 was able to give you, 4K at 60 on the front and the back. The iPhone 11 was able to do 4K at 60 on the front and the back. So for the fact that the Pixel to be used to be known as the best camera at that time, to not only be giving you 4K at 30 on the front and 1080p at 30 on the back, or vice versa, but you were only also getting a telephoto lens, not even an ultra-wide camera. That was another very weird thing that Google ended up doing here. So when I take a look at this camera in this day and age, this is probably one of the biggest downsides of buying these types of phones. You're definitely going to feel like you're having a little bit of an outdated device. And as I mentioned before, that is probably going to be one of the biggest problems here. It may not be the biggest deal to you, but that could be a problem that you might be experiencing. So I do think that in and of itself is one of the biggest things to keep in mind here. If you're going to go through and pick up a phone, you're definitely going to feel like your device is feeling like it's a little bit outdated when it comes down to that side. So in terms of that kind of covers it up there too. Now, in terms of the software longevity, this is also another very important thing to keep in mind here too, because this phone, as of this point, is pretty much already kind of done getting software support. It's been outdated basically since like Android, a couple Android versions ago on Android 13. So now that we're in Android 15, this phone is definitely kind of showing its age once again. So it's not, again, like the biggest deal in the world, but that could be one thing you might be experiencing here, that if you're going to go through and pick up this phone, well, this phone could end up giving you a little bit of a, worse experience when it does kind of come down to that software longevity, because this phone is just no longer supported with software anymore. Even in terms of battery, this phone's battery life was never like the best, but you are getting a 2800 milliamp hour battery inside of it. You're still getting wireless charging and stuff like that, which is really nice, but the performance inside of it really isn't like the best of the best in terms of the battery life. But the performance inside of this phone at that time was actually very good. So this thing was stock Android, didn't have a lot of bloatware inside of it. You were getting that Snapdragon 855 chipset inside with 6 gigs of RAM. So the performance of this phone was actually pretty decent. And this was one of the last times, Google worked with Snapdragon and Qualcomm for their chipsets. And they did it with the Pixel 5, but this was one of the last times they did it with their main lineup, with their main, chipsets of those years. And I thought this phone had a really good performing chipset inside of it. So this phone actually performed fairly well. I thought that was a really nice thing going on for this phone too. So if you were able to go through and pick up this phone, you would probably be able to see that this phone would hold up very, very well when it did kind of come down to that performance side. So for nowadays, like in today's standards, it's probably not that great of a performing phone. I just kind of have to be honest with you. It's just going to be a little bit more outdated, but it's going to be in line with something like a base model Samsung Galaxy S10, or maybe even like an iPhone 11 Pro that might be just as fast as those phones. So to kind of sum up this whole entire comparison, what I can definitely tell you is that the Google Pixel 4, I think, is still a legendary phone in some ways, but it's not really like a legendary phone in ways, in every positive way. There were some things where Google did, with this phone that just made me so upset about them. But I do think over time, this phone has definitely kind of gotten a little bit better, but it still does not make any more sense at all. It doesn't make any sense at all to go and buy this type of phone anymore. There are substantially better phones to go and buy rather than this thing. So I would definitely recommend looking at those devices. So, the phones like the Google Pixel 9, Pixel 8, Pixel 7, the Galaxy S23, Galaxy S20, the 4, the iPhone 16, iPhone 15, iPhone 13. Those phones I'd rather recommend buying rather than this one. So in terms of that kind of covers it up there. If you have any other thoughts or questions, please let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that would mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.